dropped you off that
Yeah.
first day?
Well, yeah. My first ship was in South Shields and Tyneside, at the mouth of the River Tyne.
And how old were you then?
I was 16, and yeah, I was 16 in the April, and I joined my first ship April, that's 1945, and I joined my first ship on end of January 1946. And she was the Baron Renfrew. She'd been built in 1935 on the Clyde. And she had gone through the war and had suffered damage in convoys and that, so she was in dry dock having repairs and having the guns taken off and the accommodation for the gunners and things like that.
Okay. Was that anti-aircraft stuff? Or
Anti-aircraft in midships, and on the stern, one big gun.
All right.
Big one. And that was where the gunners' accommodation had been stuck on. Well,
I'm assuming that gun could then take shots at submarines.
Exactly, yeah. At the beginning of the war, though, they didn't have enough guns, so they put in wooden replicas, hoping that it would scare the U-boats.
Well, they didn't know which
No,
way.
exactly, yeah. Anyway, it was January and it's very, very cold there, I can tell you. And we came down by train. We went from Paisley to Glasgow, and then Glasgow on a train going to London, stopping in Newcastle. And then we got, my dad planned to get another train back, so it was quite tight. So he got a taxi from, and I had a big trunk, by the way, a big cabin trunk.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we went from Newcastle down to North Shields and then across on the ferry to South Shields. And this was then dark. It was about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock at night, and it was dark. And they said, here it is, Brigham and Cowan, South Shields, you know.
Yeah.
And there was a big dock gates, huge dock gates. And the guy says, you just hammer at the road there, and he helped me off with the trunk. My dad said, bye, I've got to rush now back to get back to Paisley.
Yeah.
And off they went, and I knocked at this door. And eventually a man came and opened the gate, the gatekeeper. And I told him I was going on the Baron Renfrew. And he took me through this shipbuilding yard, where there was steel and things and that. It was all dark, you know, but you could see a light ahead, you know. And we left the big cabin trunk just at the office, at the gates. And went and the ship was in dry dock. And there was just this solitary light over the gangway. And there was an Indian on gangway duty. And I asked for the chief officer. And he said, oh, you know, he took me to the chief officer, who then told him to go and get my case and my cabin and bring it. And I found out there was no other cadets on board. I was a cadet, or apprentice deck officer was the real name for it. I was signed up on apprenticeship indentures for 4 years. So I found out there's no one else there except the chief officer.
Okay.
And about 70 Indians and a Chinese carpenter. So it was a bit dismal, you know, I didn't know what the hell to do. You know, he said, oh, there's a fish and chip shop up the road there, you can just walk up and get some fish and chips. The bad thing was that because the ship was in dry dock, there were no toilets. You couldn't use toilets.
Oh, right.
So what was provided was you walked down through the shipyard to this gatekeeper who gave you a key, and you walked along this pier out into the Tyne, where there was the shed, and you had a key, and there was a toilet in the river flowing out into the North Sea. it was really very, very primitive.
That couldn't have been very nice at night.
That was really awful. That was really pretty awful. In fact, it was a baptism fire, you know, and I hadn't been away from home much. Been in the Army Cadets and been away at camp for a couple of weeks, but coming on board, you know, when I was, you know, when the chief officer wasn't there, I was the only white guy. European.
And what was your accommodation like? Pretty basic.
Very basic. It was two lots, double bunks. So it was approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, with one porthole onto the sea side, the open side, and one onto the aft deck of the ship. And it was very tiny, so you know, I was.
And there was, when you arrived, there was just you in there?
Just me.
And how far above the sea level was the porthole? Do you remember
well, the ship had a freeboard. Freeboard is from the fully loaded situation to the deck of 7 feet.
Okay.
So, you know, when she was fully loaded, we were off in a wash, right?
Yeah.
And we were like, you know, looking on green on the side. Yeah, that one was kept screwed up.
Yeah. I was going to say, you didn't know it.
Yeah. But obviously, you know, so we had just that cabin, and then across the alleyway was a mess room, because we didn't dine with the officers. We had a cadets at a level, and we just had to do for ourselves. And what we had was one bucket of water each per day, because that was the ration. There was no running water on the ship. There was just a tank, and a Chinese carpenter had a padlock on the pump, one of these pumps.
Okay.
So you went there in the morning or in the evening, and you got your one a day. But of course, with 4 of you used to share these things. You know. It was quite primitive and quite a baptism fire. Really.
What did you enjoy about it? The whole, something you'd asked to go to see, did you? Or
I wanted to go to sea for a year before, but my parents wouldn't let me. I was accepted, but I needed I would only have been 15.
Well, and of course we were still at war then, so understandably your parents didn't want you to be at sea while the war was on.
Well, of course, at my birthday, when they agreed that if I still wanted to go to sea a year later, I could go. So I was, on 3rd of April, I was 16, and I waited the year, so I applied again and was accepted. So I was 16 in April, the war was still on. You know, VE was in May and VJ was in September of that year. So, as far as being risky, it was still very risky. Because all around the world there were just thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of mines. So we went around with our boats out, ready, but roped.
Yeah.
You know,
so if you hit the thing, you could
made it quick.
Get out quick.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah. So it was March before we sailed. So I joined at the end of January, and gradually the other cadets came back, and the engineers came on board, and so on. And, we left in March for Montreal, but we didn't have a cargo. And we had to go around the north of Scotland and do what they call a composite great circle sailing to Montreal for the opening of the Hudson River. But due to the very bad weather and the ice drifts, we had to go a bit south, because all we used to test for at night, we just kept throwing a bucket over the end of a rope and then checking the thermometer what the temperature was, because if you get near an ice floe, the temperature in the water drops quite significantly.
Okay.
So it took us about, we should have taken, I think it was 9 to 10 days. It took 2 weeks. And the cargo that we were supposed to get and come back with to the UK, another ship got back. They were the first up the river, and we were the second. So we got our cargo, which took us down to Cape Town, Port Elizabeth and Dublin. And that started a 1.5 year trip.